Guilty. The word slammed into Ike Daniels like a freight train. His world, which had once been so certain, now felt like it was crumbling beneath him. The courtroom was silent, but the oppressive weight of the verdict echoed in his mind like a loud drum, reverberating with the sting of injustice. He hadn't done it. He didn't deserve this. But the all-white jury, 12 people who didn't understand his life or the struggles he faced, had made their decision. And it was final. Or so they thought. Ike stood frozen, staring ahead at the judge, whose face was impassive, devoid of empathy. It was as though the judge had already accepted Ike's fate, and in his eyes, there was no space for doubt or reconsideration. The charges had been flimsy from the start. No solid evidence, just accusations that had been blown out of proportion by a system that was far too quick to criminalize black men. Ike had been accused of assaulting a police officer during a protest, an event he had never even been near. But the narrative spun by the prosecution was clear. A young black man, rebellious, defiant, angry at the system. A stereotype made flesh. His lawyer had fought tooth and nail to show the inconsistencies in the police reports, the contradictions in witness statements, but the jury didn't see it. They didn't want to see it. They saw what they were conditioned to see. A black man who was guilty simply because of the color of his skin. As the gavel fell and the judge announced the sentence, Ike's chest tightened. His body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of the room. He had never felt so powerless, so unseen. His family, sitting behind him, were just as stunned. His wife, Nia, held their infant son close, trying to keep him calm in the midst of the chaos. Ike's heart broke for them. They had worked so hard to build a life, only to have it ripped apart by a system that wasn't built for people like them. The courthouse doors slammed shut behind him as he was led away in handcuffs. He had no idea what was coming next. No idea how long he'd be behind bars. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't guilty, and he would fight this until his last breath. 2 weeks passed, and Ike sat in his cell, the walls closing in around him. His lawyer, Jessica, had promised him she would fight for an appeal, but he wasn't so sure anymore. The system had made up its mind. The jury had spoken, and in Ike's mind, they had already written his life story. But then, one evening, Jessica came to see him with something that would change everything. "Ike," she said, her voice full of urgency, "you're not going to believe this. We found something, new evidence." Ike's eyes widened. New evidence? After everything that had happened, was it possible? Jessica continued, her voice trembling with excitement. "Security footage from the night of the protest has surfaced. It was hidden by the police, intentionally kept from the defense during the trial. It shows you weren't even close to the incident. You weren't even near the police officer. And the person who assaulted the officer is clearly someone else." I could hardly breathe. After everything he'd been through, the days of despair, the nights of hopelessness, this felt like a lifeline. But it wasn't just the footage that got his heart racing. It was the realization that the prosecution had known about this evidence and chose to withhold it. They had intentionally kept the truth from the jury. They had manipulated the system to ensure his conviction. "This is it, Jessica," Ike said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "This is what we need. If this gets out, I can be exonerated." Jessica nodded, but her expression was grim. "It's not that simple. The jury's verdict still stands. The judge has to accept the new evidence. And the prosecution, they'll fight tooth and nail to keep you behind bars." Ike's pulse raced. "We can't let them get away with this." "I know," Jessica said, determined in her voice. "We won't, but we have to move fast." A week later, Ike stood in the courtroom once again, but this time, it was different. The weight of the past few months still hung heavy on him, but now he had something that could change everything. The courtroom was packed. The media had gotten wind of the new evidence, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The jury from the first trial was nowhere to be found, and Ike couldn't help but wonder if they regretted their decision. If they were watching, would they feel the same shame that Ike felt when he was wrongly convicted? Would they understand the magnitude of their error? Jessica stood beside him, a stack of papers in her hand, ready to present the evidence that would turn the tide. "I'm here today," she began, to request the court's consideration of new evidence, evidence that was hidden from the defense during the trial. And that evidence. Before she could finish, the prosecutor stood up, his face full of contempt. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence has already been presented to the court," he said, his voice sharp. The judge, a middle-aged white man with a stern face, raised his hand for silence. "Sustained," he said coldly. Ike's heart sank. The game was rigged. He could see it in the way the prosecutor spoke, in the way the judge moved his hand to silence Jessica. They weren't going to let him go that easily. The system had already decided what was going to happen, and they were going to make sure the truth stayed buried. But Jessica wasn't done. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this evidence was not available to the defense at the time of the trial. It was hidden by the police, who had no interest in letting it see the light of day. The footage clearly shows Mr. Daniels was nowhere near the officer when the alleged assault took place. This is the truth that has been kept from the jury, and it's time for that truth to be known." The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on the judge. For the first time since the trial began, Ike felt a glimmer of hope. The judge looked down at the evidence and then back at Ike. His expression softened, just for a moment. "I will take this new evidence into consideration," the judge said, his voice much quieter than before. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks." Ike stood still, his body shaking, but his heart swelling with the possibility of freedom. For the first time in months, he felt like there was a chance, a real chance to be free. But even as the judge's gavel fell, Ike knew this wasn't the end. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Ike Daniels stood, his pulse racing as the judge announced that he would consider the new evidence, the footage that could clear his name and bring his torment to an end. But Ike knew that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The system didn't just let go of its prisoners that easily. His life, his future, his very freedom, it was all hanging by a thin thread. Jessica, his lawyer, had been fighting tirelessly for months. The moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived, but Ike couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The prosecutor, dressed in his expensive suit, eyes cold with disdain, would never let this go without a fight. 2 weeks, Jessica had said as she walked out of the courtroom with Ike that day, her voice filled with both hope and fear. 2 weeks, and we'll know if the judge will overturn the conviction. But for Ike, 2 weeks felt like a lifetime. His mind was constantly racing, replaying every moment from the trial, from the night he was arrested, the way the jury had looked at him, not as an innocent man caught in a corrupt system, but as a criminal just because of the color of his skin. The weight of that judgment pressed down on him with every breath. As he sat in his cell that night, Ike's thoughts turned to his family. Nia, his wife, had been his rock. She visited him every week, bringing their son Malik Jr. to see him. Their visits were always filled with love, but also with the quiet sadness of a family torn apart. Ike longed to hold his son, to tell him that everything would be okay. But in the deepest part of his soul, Ike knew that nothing would be okay until the system gave him back his life. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the day of the hearing arrived. Ike could feel the eyes of the world on him, the weight of every false assumption made against him hanging over his shoulders. News cameras lined the walls, capturing every moment, every word. The judge entered the courtroom, his eyes scanning the room before he sat down. There was a palpable sense of nervous energy in the air. Ike could see Jessica whispering to the judge's clerk, her eyes fixed on the evidence folder in her hands. She was calm, but I could tell she was just as anxious as he was. Jessica stood up first, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Your Honor, as you know, we are here today to present new evidence that was not available to the defense at the time of the trial. We have the footage from the night of the incident. The footage clearly shows my client, Mr. Daniels, was not involved in the alleged assault of Officer Reynolds. He was not even in the vicinity of the crime scene." The prosecutor stood, his face a mask of cold arrogance. "Your Honor, we have already been through this." The jury rendered their verdict based on the evidence available at the time. Introducing new evidence at this point is not only irrelevant, but would undermine the integrity of the judicial process. The judge glanced at the prosecutor, his face unreadable. He then turned to Jessica. I am aware of your position, Ms. O'Connell, but this is an unusual case. I will take the new evidence into consideration. The court will reconvene in 2 hours. Ike's heart pounded in his chest. 2 hours. That's all they had. 2 hours to determine if the truth would finally be heard. 2 hours to see if they could finally undo the wrong that had been done to him. The courtroom was eerily quiet during the recess. Ike sat with Jessica, waiting for the judge's decision, but the silence was deafening. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, and every passing second felt like an eternity. Jessica was flipping through papers, reviewing the new evidence once again. Ike couldn't stop himself from glancing around the room. The same cold stares from the prosecution team, the same indifferent glares from the jury box. The only difference now was that Ike had a glimmer of hope. That glimmer had the potential to change everything. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Nia. "How's it going, babe? I'm praying for you. I know this is it. You're coming home." Ike felt a lump form in his throat. How could he tell her that he wasn't sure? How could he tell her that the fight might still not be over? But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his family. He had to fight for them. For Malik Jr. He texted back, "I'm doing my best. Stay strong for me. I'll be home soon." The words felt empty, but they were all he could offer. The gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the recess. The judge walked back into the room, his face still stern. He looked at the gallery, then at the defense and prosecution, before speaking. "I have reviewed the new evidence. After careful consideration, I have decided that the evidence presented is sufficient to warrant an overturned conviction." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. For a moment, Ike thought he might have heard wrong. The prosecutor's face paled, his mouth moving, but no words came out. Jessica stood, her arms raised slightly in victory, but her expression remained solemn. The fight was far from over, but this was a win. I could feel the weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't going to spend another day in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He would be free. But as he stood there, the gravity of the situation began to hit him. But before I could fully absorb the news, a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "I object." It was the prosecutor, his voice trembling with frustration. "This isn't over. You can't just change the verdict like this. We're going to appeal." The judge raised his hand for silence. "The verdict stands, Mr. Stevens. The evidence has been reviewed. This case is closed." But just as the court began to clear, something strange happened. The courtroom door burst open, and 2 federal agents entered. They were tall, stoic, and dressed in dark suits. Their eyes scanned the room before fixing on Ike. "Mr. Daniels, we need to speak with you," one of the agents said, his voice cold. Ike's heart dropped. What was going on? Why were federal agents here now? Jessica stepped forward, her expression one of immediate concern. "What is this about?" she demanded. "We have new information that may change things further," the agent said, his tone cryptic. "We need Mr. Daniels to come with us." Ike's heart pounded at his chest as the federal agents approached him. The courtroom, still echoing with the shock of the judge's ruling, suddenly felt suffocating. The victory that had felt so sweet only moments ago now seemed distant, as though the world was about to shift once again beneath his feet. The 2 agents, their expressions unreadable, didn't even glance at Jessica as they moved toward Ike. They weren't here to congratulate him. No, their presence meant something far more ominous. Ike's instinct was to step back, but he didn't. He had fought so hard for this moment. He wouldn't back down now. "Mr. Daniels," one of the agents spoke again, his tone cold and commanding. "We need to speak with you. It's urgent." Ike stood frozen, his body tense, but he held his ground. "What's going on? What is this about?" he asked, his voice filled with suspicion and rising anxiety. Jessica moved closer, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "I'm his lawyer. You're not taking him anywhere unless I'm present." The agents exchanged a quick look, one that didn't escape Ike's notice. Something about this didn't feel right. The fact that they were here, at this exact moment, raised a dozen questions in his mind. "Mr. Daniels," the second agent spoke this time, his voice low but firm. "It's about the case. There's more to it than you know. Please come with us. It's important." Ike felt a cold chill run down his spine. I'm not going anywhere until you explain. I just won my case. What more is there to discuss? But before the agent could respond, a figure appeared at the door, a woman, tall and confident, her posture commanding attention. She was dressed in a professional suit, her expression as steely as the agent's as she approached them. I'm Danielle Graves, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I've been following this case closely. Whatever this is, you'll need to speak with me first. The agents exchanged a glance, their silence making it clear they hadn't anticipated anyone like her showing up. Ike's eyes narrowed. He didn't know this woman, but he felt an odd sense of relief wash over him. If she was here, then maybe, just maybe, she could help him navigate whatever this was. The agent who had been speaking to Ike finally let out a sigh. Fine, we'll explain everything in due time, but we're not going to discuss this here. Please come with us. Ike looked over at Jessica, who seemed just as bewildered as he was. She nodded silently, urging him to stay calm. He turned back to Danielle, who now stood beside him, her gaze focused on the agents with an air of quiet authority. I'm not going anywhere without proper explanation, Ike said, his voice growing firmer with each word. You don't just walk in here and drag me out without saying what this is about. Danielle stepped forward, her voice cutting through the uncertainty. If you want him, you'll have to tell us why. I'm sure you understand the law. The agents exchanged looks once more. Finally, the second agent spoke again, his voice reluctant. There's been a development in your case, Mr. Daniels. Something you might want to know. I'm listening, Ike replied, his heart hammering now. The agent motioned toward the hallway, and as if on cue, another officer entered with a folder in hand. This just came through, the officer said, placing the file in front of Ike. We didn't think you'd see it this soon, but it's urgent. Ike opened the file, his hands trembling. Inside were new reports, notes on an investigation that didn't seem to be about him at all. The name on the top of the first page made his stomach drop. Jason Marlowe, corruption and extortion. What the hell is this? Ike asked, his voice shaking. Danielle's face had already gone cold. You weren't just set up, Mr. Daniels. There's more to this case than the trial. The man who accused you, he's been part of a network, an underground operation. Ike's mind raced. Who? What network? What are you talking about? The agent leaned in, his tone gravely serious. The person who falsely accused you was part of a much larger conspiracy. A network of people working to drive black families out of this neighborhood. He didn't just target you. He's been involved in targeting other families, others like you, people who were never supposed to be here. It's been happening for years. Ike stared at the papers, his mind struggling to piece everything together. So this whole thing, this wasn't about me at all. I was just in the way. Danielle nodded grimly. Exactly. Jason Marlowe, your accuser, has been orchestrating false accusations, creating an atmosphere of fear, and working with local developers to clear out black residents. He's been planting false evidence, falsifying statements, and using the police to intimidate families like yours. Ike felt his stomach drop. All this time, he had been fighting for his life, his freedom, thinking that the system had just failed him. But this was worse than he imagined. It wasn't just an isolated injustice. It was a coordinated effort to target and remove entire communities. What do you mean, developers? Ike asked, his voice low. Local developers, the agent repeated. They've been buying up properties for years, manipulating the market, and using people like Jason Marlowe to push out the families they don't want. You were just another pawn in their game. Ike's eyes widened. And the police? The police, Danielle replied, have been complicit. Some of them were on Marlowe's payroll. He had an entire operation working to make sure black families didn't have a chance to hold on to their homes. He wanted them out of the way for profit. I could hardly process it all. The trial, the police, the jury. It was all a part of something bigger than he ever could have imagined. This isn't just about me, is it? Ike asked. They've done this to other families. Danielle nodded. Yes, and the ones who fought back, like you, have been targeted. You're not the first to fall victim, and you won't be the last unless we expose this." Ike sat in stunned silence as the pieces fell into place. He was no longer just fighting for his own freedom. He was fighting for an entire community, for families who had been systematically pushed out, for people who had been victims of a system that turned a blind eye to their suffering. The weight of the situation hit him all at once. "So what do we do now?" Danielle looked him in the eye. "We expose them, but we can't do this alone. We need allies in the right places, people who can take down the system from within." Ike nodded. "Then we start fighting back." The clock ticked louder than ever as Ike sat in his small office, the weight of everything that had happened settling heavily on his chest. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, his life turned upside down by a corrupt system that had tried to break him. The conspiracy he had uncovered was vast, far-reaching, and dark, but the truth was out now. The documents spread out on the desk in front of him, pages upon pages of evidence, showed the depths of the betrayal. It wasn't just about Jason Marlowe, the man who had falsely accused him of assault. It was about a group of wealthy, powerful developers who had been working together to push black families out of their homes, to gentrify entire neighborhoods, and to profit from their misfortune. They'd used false accusations, intimidation, and even the police to carry out their plan. Ike had seen it all. The fake property appraisals, the under-the-table deals, the bribes to local officials, and the manipulative tactics that made families like his feel like they had no choice but to leave. But now, it was Ike's turn to fight back. The next few days were filled with meetings with journalists, public defenders, and civil rights organizations. The world needed to know what had been happening in their city. The media had already picked up on the story, and Ike was at the center of it all. His story was making waves. It was trending on social media, with hashtags like #JusticeForIke, #ExposeTheConspiracy, and #BlackLivesMatter filling every feed. People were listening, but the most powerful part of it all, the way the community had rallied behind him. Neighbors, friends, even strangers were standing together, demanding justice, not just for Ike, but for every black family who had been wronged by the system. Ike knew this fight was bigger than him. It was about dismantling a system that had been built to oppress people like him for generations. The day of the public trial arrived with a sense of anticipation that could be felt in the air. The courtroom was packed with people, families, activists, journalists, and community leaders, all there to witness the justice that had long been denied. Ike stood at the center of it all, his heart beating strong in his chest. He wasn't afraid anymore. This time, he had the truth on his side. Danielle Graves, the civil rights attorney who had helped him uncover the conspiracy, stood by his side as they prepared to present their case. The entire prosecution team had been dismantled, their lies laid bare for everyone to see. The developers who had orchestrated the gentrification scheme were being exposed, one by one. But it wasn't just the developers. It was the corrupt officers, the city officials who had turned a blind eye, and the jury who had convicted Ike without a shred of real evidence. They had all been complicit in a system of injustice. Ike took a deep breath as he walked into the courtroom. His heart was steady, his resolve unshakable. He knew this was the moment where everything would change. The prosecutor, now visibly shaken, had no choice but to watch as the truth was revealed. Danielle stood before the court and began speaking. "Your Honor, members of the jury, and respected court, today we stand here not just for Mr. Ike Daniels, but for every individual who has ever been targeted because of the color of their skin. This case is not just about one man's wrongful conviction. It's about the systemic racism that continues to plague our justice system. It's about the corrupt actions of powerful people who think they can control entire communities. But no more." Her words rang out with power, with a truth that couldn't be ignored. Mr. Daniels has been wrongfully convicted. The evidence that was withheld, the lies that were told, the systems that enabled this to happen, all of it is here for you to see. And I ask you today to make the right choice. The courtroom was silent as the weight of her words hung in the air. The jury, who had once convicted Ike without question, now looked at him with new eyes. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Ike had been wronged. The truth had been laid bare, and the corruption that had plagued their city was finally being exposed. The judge, who who had once been complicit in allowing this case to go forward, now looked at Ike with something resembling respect. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was not just a case about one man, but about the entire system. The final verdict came as a shock to everyone, but it was a shock of relief, of joy, and of vindication. Ike Daniels was exonerated. His conviction was overturned. And for the first time in months, Ike was free. Free from the chains of a system that had tried to break him. But the real victory wasn't just in his freedom. The real victory came when the developers, the corrupt officials, and the police officers involved in the conspiracy were held accountable. The media coverage was overwhelming. News outlets across the country were broadcasting the story, sharing the truth of what had happened, and calling out the system for what it was. The developers were charged with multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The police officers who had been involved were also investigated, with several facing criminal charges. But the fight didn't end there. As the news spread, so did the wave of activism that Ike had inspired. Protests erupted, demanding systemic change. People marched, rallied, and organized in ways that they never had before. Ike's fight had become a movement that was about so much more than one man's freedom. It was about the freedom of every black person who had been wronged by the system, every family that had been forced to fight for what was rightfully theirs. And in the midst of it all, Ike knew that this was just the beginning. He had won, but there was still work to do. There were still people out there who were suffering in silence, still families who had been pushed out of their homes, still communities that were being targeted. Ike couldn't stop now. He had come too far to turn back. The day Ike walked out of the courthouse, he was not just a man who had been wronged. He was a symbol of what could happen when people came together to fight for justice. He had become a hero in the eyes of many, someone who had taken on the system and won. As Ike stood on the steps of the courthouse, Nia and Malik Jr. by his side, he raised his fist in the air. A wave of applause erupted from the crowd gathered outside, and a roar of support echoed through the streets. This wasn't just his victory. It was the victory of every person who had ever been unjustly convicted, every person who had ever felt their voice silenced. But Ike knew there was still more to do. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. This is the story of one man's fight for freedom. But it's not just about Ike Daniels. It's about all of us. The system may try to silence us, to push us down, but we will rise. If you believe in justice, if you believe in standing up against the forces that try to keep us oppressed, share this story. Let the world know that we won't be ignored. Like, comment, and share if you believe in fighting for what's right. Ike's victory is a victory for us all, but the fight isn't over. We need your voice. Together, we can make change happen. Together, we can bring justice to those who have been wronged. Join the movement. Stand for justice. Stand for Ike. Stand for all of us.